Chapter 8. A Flicker of Faith. A few minutes later, Dr. Campbell's buggy appeared on the horizon, his form cutting through a gathering mist. Clara hurried to the house to prepare for his arrival, Margaret falling in step beside her. Peter and Mrs. Kelly rested in the parlor, and they slipped past, not wanting to disturb them. As Clara entered the kitchen, a wave of dizziness washed over her, more intense than ever. She leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. "Sit down," Margaret said, pulling out a chair. She glided through the kitchen, measuring coffee into the pot. A jay swooped past the window, its blue flash startling against the colorless day. "Strange," she mused, her back to Clara. "Edward speaks endlessly of efficiency, yet he misses how the simplest moments hold their own grace." Clara's dizziness slowly ebbed. She noticed how her sister-in-law's hands faltered at the mention of her husband's name, then busied themselves rearranging spoons. "When?" Margaret asked, her fingers styling on the silver. "When what?" "You know what I'm asking. Be truthful and clear." Margaret dropped her voice, although no one was near. "I see the way you press your hand against your waist when you think no one watches. The same signs I remember from my friend Alice in Chicago, just before she told me her joyful news." "A few weeks." Clara's teacup sat half empty on the table, the tea gone cold from her earlier breakfast. Her finger slid over the rim. "I haven't told Nathan yet. After all the disappointments." "I knew it," Margaret began, but the clip-clop of horses' hooves from Dr. Campbell's buggy cut through their conversation. Andrew Bennett's Model T pulled up behind the buggy, its engine rattling to a stop. "I'll show Dr. Campbell to Mrs. Kelly," Clara said. As they proceeded through the parlor, Margaret straightened her skirts and patted her hair, a becoming flush rising to her cheeks before stepping on the porch to greet Andrew. The young lawyer had called on her twice since she'd arrived, ostensibly to discuss contracts, while his prolonged glances at her suggested other interests. While Dr. Campbell examined Mrs. Kelly, Clara overheard Andrew and Margaret in a tense discussion. "Edward's plans are perfectly legal," Andrew was saying, his tone suggesting he wished otherwise. "However, the State House Committee isn't only documenting crafts, they're considering preservation laws. If we can prove the cultural value of traditional woodworking—" "Through Nathan's skill," Margaret finished. "You're brilliant, Andrew." Clara caught the flirtation in Margaret's voice and shook her head, slipping past the parlor where Dr. Campbell examined Mrs. Kelly. Peter sat nearby, watching his mother with worried eyes. Clara paused in the doorway, the dizziness returning. The kitchen offered refuge. She should start the bread. The ingredients waited on the counter: flour, yeast, and salt, though the mere thought of kneading made the room spin. Minutes later, Thomas burst in, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Josephine learned from Mrs. Proctor that Edward's plans are already in motion. His lawyers sent all the documents to the selectmen weeks ago, the contracts and the proposals. They all signed to call a special meeting. Clara blinked. "Without even seeing Edward first?" "Money talks, and he promised them plenty. He's arriving on tonight's train to finish what his telegram started and staying at the Bracebridges place on Maple Street. He's closer to the town hall, and it's a few miles to where the railway station sits, right by the land he's considering for his factory." Clara didn't question the circumstances. Thomas raised an eyebrow, apparently reading her thoughts. "Seems strange," he acknowledged. "Husband and wife, not wanting to be together. But Margaret brushed it off and said he didn't wish to inconvenience my household." Still, Clara couldn't shake the sense that Edward preferred the Bracebridge home, a respectable address where the widow asked few questions, a place where he wouldn't have to answer for his late evenings, his comings and goings, Although no one spoke of it directly, there was obviously a marriage rift between Margaret and Edward. He tempts job seekers with the promise of weekly wages and steam-powered innovation, Thomas went on. He has already persuaded half the villagers. Let him. Nathan joined them in the kitchen. We're not fighting progress, remember? This is a deeper cause, more than furniture pieces. We create chapters in people's lives, meant to be passed down, bearing witness to births and deaths and everything between. That's what we're preserving. Dr. Campbell appeared, his medical bag swinging at his side like a faithful companion. The leather case betrayed its decades of house calls, corners buffed smooth by countless door frames, brass clasps gone green with age. It released its particular blend of medicines and memories, witch hazel, eucalyptus oil, and pipe smoke embedded in its seams. He'd worn grooves in the handle's patina, marking thousands of sick bed vigils. At his gesture toward the passage beyond the kitchen, Clara understood and stepped away from the others, the floorboards marking their retreat from curious ears. A few more days of rest will see Mrs. Kelly right again, he said, tucking his stethoscope into his bag. Thank you. Clara nodded, swaying slightly. His eyes, sharpened by decades of reading symptoms, studied Clara's face. Mrs. Whitmore, are you unwell? His features bore the wear of long nights and harsh winters, with creases that expanded around his eyes, indications of both the grief he'd shouldered for patients lost and the placid humor he extended to those still fighting. A thick mustache, more salt than pepper, framed a mouth set in an attentive line. She steadied herself. Instead of leaving, he studied her with the same careful attention he'd given her mother years ago. I believe Mrs. Kelly isn't my only patient today. How long have you been experiencing symptoms? A while. If you'll permit me? He gestured toward a room in the back, his manner both professional and paternal. The sewing room is more appropriate. Shortly thereafter, her hands quivered as she sat on a cushioned chair for her examination, grateful for the doctor's discretion. 6 weeks along, more or less, by my estimation, he said, when he withdrew with a satisfied smile. Everything appears strong and healthy this time. Shall I speak with Nathan? Number not yet. Tears of joy puddled in her eyes. He has enough on his mind. The floorboard's protest announced him before she saw him. Nathan stood in the doorframe, one palm braced against the wood as if his legs might buckle. His eyes found hers, asking questions his lips couldn't form. The sun through the window cast squares of light on the floor between them, and Clara thought of all the boundaries they'd crossed to reach this moment. Clara? Her name barely escaped his throat as he rushed to her. Years of loss and longing crystallized into a single breath. Some moments were worth every heartache that led to them. She reached for Nathan's hand and placed it on her waist. He found the ladder-back chair by instinct alone, his calloused fingers still splayed against her waist as if touching a priceless treasure. When did you, A short while, she said. This time feels different. This time I feel grace renewing itself. How often had she sat in this room, mending Nathan's work shirts, dreaming of tiny garments to stitch. Now those dreams took solid form beneath her husband's trembling palm, as real as any design he'd ever coaxed from raw lumber. I wanted to be certain, she continued, after last time. Dr. Campbell reached into his vest for a gold pocket watch, a gift from a grateful family years ago. It ticked faintly as a reminder of lives saved and moments lost. I'll leave you two to talk. Mrs. Kelly needs rest, plenty of broth, and no excitement for at least a week. I'll tell her as much. He gathered his bag, then paused. Clara, no heavy lifting or long hours standing at the schoolhouse. As he exited, Margaret entered, Andrew and Thomas trailing behind her. Oh, then it's certain? She pressed her hands to her mouth, then rushed to embrace Clara. Exactly as I suspected. The way you've been glowing lately. What's this? Thomas asked, marching into the already crowded room. You're going to be an uncle, Margaret announced, and I'm going to be an aunt. His steps wavered. He glanced from Clara to Nathan, years of shared grief and hope passing between the brothers. Then he clapped Nathan on the shoulder, the gesture conveying all the words he didn't speak. The first time Clara had been expecting, Nathan had poured his heart into building the finest cradle in all New England. That cradle sat wrapped in their attic, a testament to dreams deferred. Nathan, Thomas began, the Henderson cradle can wait. Finish the one for your own child. There are probably final touches. Number, the Henderson cradle matters more than ever. Nathan rose. He met Clara's gaze before facing his brother. Think of it, our children living in a world where factories stamp out cradles like newspapers, each one identical, soulless. The committee needs to see why a cradle shaped from hands that know every whirl of grain holds a family's dreams, and why that matters. Andrew Bennett stood in the doorway and clutched papers. Let me help. If we can prove the cultural significance of traditional techniques, we'll need examples, Margaret said. Not the fancy pieces that won prizes, the ones that tell stories, such as Mrs. Kelly's rocking chair. I have some of Father's old sketches, Thomas offered. You do? Nathan asked. Yes. Thomas offered no further explanation. He didn't have to. He'd kept the sketches safe after Nathan had shoved them aside, along with everything else from his store days. After everyone left, Nathan and Clara lingered in the sewing room. Dawn had brightened into a full afternoon, setting the snow ablaze with light. Nathan sketched a pattern on the icy glass, not his usual leaves and vines. Something new. A tree, its branches reaching heavenward while its roots spread deep. When you crafted that snow figure, he said, you mapped our path forward. We carve space for what lasts, what runs bone deep. She nodded, her heart overflowing with a future awakening with possibility. At the kitchen table, Margaret and Andrew pored over documents while Thomas read their father's journal. From the parlor came the murmur of Mrs. Kelly telling a story to Peter. The aroma of coffee drifted through the house, along with leather bindings and aged paper. Edward waves a promise of factory payrolls and modern machinery, Andrew said, his ink-stained fingers drumming against the papers. The chairman of the board, Mr. Ebenezer Proctor, seems particularly swayed. Of course he is. Margaret paced to the stove to pour more coffee. His daughter's engagement ring came from a Chicago jewelry store. He thinks local craftsmen are... She stopped, glancing at Nathan. Obsolete? Nathan bent over his father's drafting table, salvaged from its exile in the barn loft, where he'd banished all remnants of the store. He organized sepia-toned photographs documenting his most outstanding work. Young Lara Matthews from Amherst, whose father had been photographing Whitmore furniture since before the war, had captured the chapel in morning light with an artist's eye for shadow and form, and a formal studio shot of the rejected dining suite before selling the suite at a loss to a Pittsfield dealer. 12 chairs with hand-etched rosettes, a massive table that would seat 20 of Boston's elite, and a sideboard with brass fittings that had taken 3 months alone, all photographed in pristine condition before the governor's wife had found fault. Last came the carefully posed shot of the orphanage children discovering intricately crafted creatures on the bookcases in their reading room. Clara scurried between them, serving coffee, fresh white bread, and blueberry jam. She noticed how Andrew's eyes followed Margaret's every movement. When their hands brushed over a legal document, neither pulled away. Andrew's fountain pen had left ink stains on his fingers that matched the blue-black smudges on Margaret's fingers where she touched the wet signatures. The spots branded them both as conspirators in this quiet rebellion against her husband's steel and steam-powered plans. Silver chimes pierced the air, and Clara recognized the cadence before glimpsing the source, Daisy's hoofbeats, marking time like a metronome. The mare emerged through the winter haze, muscles rippling beneath her dappled coat as she guided Mrs. Henderson's buggy toward them. Clara's throat tightened at the sight. Here was the horse that had once pulled their own wagon, carrying Nathan's masterworks to mansions and chapel doors. Even under another's reins, Daisy kept the dignified bearing of a craftsman's steed. The mare's bridle jingled outside, and Nathan's shoulders went taut as bowstrings. His eyes fixed on nothing, yet Clara saw him mapping Daisy's location by sound alone, the way she'd stamp one hoof, then pause. A habit unchanged since the day they'd handed over her reins to pay the store's last debts. Mrs. Henderson rushed inside, unwinding her fox fur collar. "I heard about Edward Parker's factory," she declared. "Nathan, the cradle you're building for my grandchild? Well, my daughter-in-law is being pressured to cancel your commission." Clara moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "I brought one of your exquisite pieces to illustrate exactly why I won't permit it." Mrs. Henderson opened her beaded reticule, its silk tassels swinging, and withdrew a tiny wooden box. "You crafted this for my daughter's hope chest, Nathan, when you were first starting out." The box was basic pine. Carved into the lid was a detailed scene, a young woman beneath a bower of roses, her face craned upward. Its polished surface revealed the woman in layers. Here, a glance of joy. There a hint of dreams. Nathan's cuts had mapped more than features. He'd trapped time itself into the timber. His lessons rang clear. True craftsmanship preserved more than images. It trapped fleeting instances in amber, safeguarding them in 3 dimensions that no photograph could match. "Every day," Mrs. Henderson said, "I open this box and recall that young girl brimming with dreams. Your type of skill is worth protecting." Thomas studied the box. "I remember when you carved this, big brother. You let me practice on scraps of pine until I got the roses right." "Your table stood square," Nathan replied, "while I got lost in the woods' wild promises." "Maybe we both forgot the true purpose of our craft and what Father taught us," Thomas said, "about balance, about collaborating." "That's it." Andrew's head snapped up, legal papers sliding to the side. "The preservation statutes protect cultural heritage. If we can prove that traditional artistry represents not only products, but a way of life, a relationship between brothers, between generations." "They've posted the notice at the town hall," Margaret cut in. "Special meeting next Tuesday. Edward didn't delay securing the selectmen's signatures." And the letter pressed against Clara's hip like a secret wanting to be told. She met Nathan's glance. "Boston wrote. They've given Nathan a platform to defend what we're fighting for." 3 weeks from Thursday," Andrew said, skimming the letter and tapping the State House seal before handing it to the others. "The State House committee requires written testimony 7 days before the hearing, but that battle waits. Edward's proposed railroad deal could lock up the land before we marshal our defense." Margaret crossed her arms. "Explain the timeline to me again." "We need 2 victories, but Edward only needs 1, Andrew said. If the village agrees to sell, Boston's ruling won't matter. If Boston rules against preservation, Edward can pressure the next village and the next. The state committee could still rule against preservation, Clara finished, leaving every village vulnerable to the next factory that comes calling. Which is exactly what Edward is counting on, Nathan added. He only needs one door to open, either the selectmen's vote or the state ruling, while we need both doors to stay closed. He gestured to Mrs. Henderson. May we borrow your pine box at a later time? And will you consider speaking for us? Tell the residents what handcrafted pieces represent to this community? Of course. Mrs. Henderson clicked the box closed. Those machines of Edward's might produce 100 boxes an hour, but they can't produce magic. She glanced at Margaret and shrugged. I'm sorry, dear. I know he's your husband, but machines are incapable of producing memories. She gathered her belongings, the little box tucked safely in her reticule. They drew the battle lines. First up, a narrative etched in wood and memory, in brotherhood and expectation. As evening descended, Clara sat by herself in the kitchen. The day's papers lay scattered, Andrew's legal documents and sketches. A teacup marked a ring on a property map, while penciled measurements in the margins spoke of Nathan's father's precise hand. A shuffle of footsteps made her turn. Mrs. Kelly braced herself against the doorframe, her borrowed shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Peter and I are going home, she declared, her chin lifted despite her pallor. We've imposed long enough. The rocking chair creaked, as if protesting her departure. In that sound, Clara heard the voice of every proud New England woman who'd ever stood alone against winter's bitter mathematics. You'll do no such thing, she replied. Not until you've regained your strength. She guided Mrs. Kelly back to the parlor, into Nathan's carved rocking chair. The wood had already begun taking the polish that comes from daily use, the fox's clever face growing smoother under Mrs. Kelly's hands. Peter moved to the hearth, nudging at a loose brick with the toe of his shoe. His eyes kept finding the workshop door visible through the window. Mr. Whitmore mentioned he might allow me to help again. There's a maple chair I can help sand. Another reason to stay, Clara said. Boot heels struck the porch boards. Clara reached the door as Andrew's silhouette blocked the light. He clutched his hat, knuckles pale. Edward forced their hand. The factory vote. They've moved it up. Clara gripped the doorframe. When? 2 days hence. He straightened his shoulders. But we haven't lost the battle yet. 48 hours to defend what generations had built. 2 days to prove beauty's importance over efficiency, a value beyond profit and production quotas. I'll find Nathan, she said. As she rushed to his workshop, he was already stepping out. His jaw cut a hard line against the pale January dusk. He'd heard. The hours are few, she began. The hours will serve. He drew her palm to his chest, where his heart drummed as steadily as a craftsman's mallet. I've been shaping simple pieces, denying what these hands were meant to create. Our child deserves to watch me work without shame. Beyond, Clara's snow angel gleamed, a white silhouette etched against the sky's slate canvas, a testament pressed against earth and sky. This wasn't only the saving of Nathan's mastery. This was more profound, a story of brothers, of community,